Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. So today I want to talk about Dubai versus Singapore. This is just my impression of what it is to set up a business and operate from Dubai versus Singapore. I've seen, it's been quite hotly debated. I think for me, at least from my point of view, I've been based in Singapore for coming on 10 years now. But during the lockdowns with the recent health crisis, kind of Dubai really came into its own, I think. I mean, Dubai was always there as a financial center for the Middle East. But for a while, it was the only international city that remained open more or less during the lockdown. So, it really kind of rose to preeminence. And I think with the recent conflicts in Russia, between Russia and Ukraine, it has even become more important as there's been an influx of business professionals from that area. So just want to have a kind of quick conversation about that. And obviously it is super subjective. Everybody will have their point of view, and I invite you to comment below, or you can reach out to us via our website, hej.tax. So right, Singapore, what are my impressions? I've been here for a while. Obviously, because I've spent more time here in Singapore, I'm going to be more biased, obviously. I think that's natural. I've been a resident of Dubai for just over 2 years now. We set up an office there. We set up a small presence in Dubai in late 2020, early 2021, I think it was. But in Singapore, we're pretty established. We probably have just over 30 staff at the office in the business district here in Singapore. So obviously Singapore is more of a jurisdiction for us. But anyway, having said that, Singapore, I mean, from in terms of perhaps some of the challenges Singapore has, is its size. It's small. It's relatively small. It's way more expensive in general. But having said that, there are parts of Dubai that are pretty expensive. Like on the Palm, for example. So if you have that level of expensive taste, I'm sure it can be satisfied in either jurisdiction. But generally speaking, Singapore is probably more expensive, and Singapore is definitely harder to get into. So which makes sense naturally given its small size and the demand for residency in Singapore being what it is. It's gonna be harder. Whereas Dubai, it's so big, it's so huge. And remember, it's not just Dubai, but it's one of 7 or so Emirates. So I was living in Sharjah for a while, at an apartment in Sharjah, which is you're driving from Sharjah to Dubai. There's traffic, but you don't really tell you're moving from one emirate to the other. So there are options for those who don't want to live in Dubai. So, when you consider the other Emirates as options, you have a lot to choose from. Now, in terms of its strengths, I think Singapore, it's an incredibly strong brand. It's really very, very well regulated. Banking is excellent. It is a financial center. It's probably like a second tier financial center in my mind after London and New York. I'd put Singapore and Hong Kong, despite its challenges. There's still a lot of activity going in Hong Kong as a gateway to China. So it is excellent banking, easy networking because it's such a small space. So it's easy to get to know people and to mix and mingle. It's a slightly bigger economy as well. So it's slightly bigger in terms of GDP in US dollars. So it's slightly bigger than the Emirates. It's half the size. It's 5 million versus the Emirates, 10 million roughly, whereas it's a bigger economy. So that gives you a sense of its scope. So Dubai, on the other hand, its reputation. So I'll treat it in the same way, I did when I commented on Dubai. I'll give 3 or so pros and 3 or so cons. Which is what I did with Dubai. So its reputation as a financial center, as a business center, is not as strong as, let's say, Singapore. Of course, for those who follow, it was put back on the gray list. It was on the blacklist previously. It came off the blacklist. Now it's on the gray list as of 2022. So I'm recording this in 2022, the end of 2022. So it got into the gray list earlier this year. We remember during the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009, Dubai had a lot of problems, and there were some scary stories. Property prices were getting softer, as they were in many parts of the world, unfortunately. And the financial crisis in Dubai was particularly acute, and Abu Dhabi had to bail them out. So I think that is common knowledge. And of course, as a result of that, and as evidenced by that, people use that as evidence. People, certain economists or certain business commentators online, general, they've been a bit skeptical of the sustainability of the business model for Dubai. I mean, it's done a fantastic job, no doubt, of moving away from this dependency on fossil fuels. But as to how sustainable it is going forward, it is subject to debate, as everything should be. You should debate both sides. Another thing was in 2017, there was in one of the neighboring Gulf states, I won't say which one, you know which one it is, a certain member of the royal family, he held his relatives, they were detained. However you want to interpret that, they were detained in the Ritz-Carlton in the capital of that particular Gulf state. And what the rumor is, who knows if it's true or not, what was discussed online in certain forums is that he was able to know how much money members of his family had in Dubai because the Emirati banks were free with that information. And so they can, from certain people's point of view, they betrayed banking secrecy. But that happens all the time. So for example, you can say that the Swiss banks in the early 2000s, they, after the scandal with UBS, when the DOJ in the US put pressure on them together with the Treasury Department, the Swiss banks betrayed their own secrecy rules and they shared information with the US government. So it's not unusual. So it's a criticism, but it happened. It happens, right? It's the nature of geopolitics. And this is just like a minor annoyance, the whole situation with VPNs, that there's certain apps that some people depend on and they're unable to use because they're being blocked in the Emirates. And it is what it is. So it's a downside. So those are the downsides from in terms of the positives. Obviously it's tax free, whereas in Singapore the income is taxed. It's not a tax-free jurisdiction per se. So maybe a low tax jurisdiction. Corporate tax rate headlines at 17%, although for most people the effective tax rate is much lower. The personal tax rate, I think it tops off at 22%, maybe 24, 22%. So it's not tax-free, but it is relatively low tax. And of course, Singapore's territorial tax. So generally speaking, income that arises outside of Singapore is not taxed by Singapore in Singapore. Whereas in the Emirates, it generally is tax-free. Of course, there is a VAT. Singapore has a GST, the goods and services tax. The Emirates does have a VAT. And more recently, as it will be phased in, I believe from 2023, there's a corporate tax of 9%. But this is on companies that do business domestically. So most people that that would probably be watching this video perhaps work in the free zones, the 45 or so free zones. And the government has given an undertaking that for the next 50 years or so, that those would remain tax-free as they are right now, unless they violate the rules, and which would include doing business within, earning money, invoicing clients from within the Emirates. So 9% versus or free, much lower than in Singapore. We'll probably do another video on the tax situation in the Emirates when I get back to Dubai next week. So that's it. Singapore versus Dubai. Just my impressions. Again, please feel free to comment below or just visit us on our website, heg.tech, and share your perspective. In conclusion, it's super subjective, as I keep saying, right? But I think everybody who spends time in Singapore has a problem with how really expensive it is and how much more expensive it's becoming. The nature of demand and supply. There's not much you can do about that. There's inflation everywhere. But for Dubai, the VPN and the banking situation, I have clients that actually left the Emirates because they got frustrated. Tech people, people running certain technology platforms, and they were having problems with the connectivity, and they left. But definitely the exception for most people who are not so reliant, the VPNs do work. Or you just don't use WhatsApp, don't use Skype. There are local apps that you can use, and so so there are ways around it. So it's not a big deal. Banking, however, is probably more of a challenge. You don't have the range of private banking options that you do in Singapore. Naturally, it's a high value financial center that just makes sense. Some of the Swiss banks, some of the European banks, more American banks. If Singapore is a top tier jurisdiction, and even in terms of the domestic banks, OCBC, UOB, DBS. When you look at a ranking globally of the top tier banks in terms of the balance sheet stability and whatever, you're going to see Singapore there. Singapore is definitely, top tier banks as they are ranked and degraded in terms of risk and so on. Whereas the Middle Eastern banks probably not going to be on that list. They're probably going to be further down that list. And then those who run operating companies, they're probably going to find more challenges with Middle Eastern banks or Emirati banks, and they interface with stuff like PayPal and Stripe And I'm a client who was struggling to get US dollar bank drafts issued by the Emirati bank to pay something in the US. So some of the international banking facilities that you perhaps take for granted in a jurisdiction like Singapore, London, and New York is going to be a struggle in the Emirates. But with some sort of planning and foresight, there are perhaps ways around that. But just generally speaking, those are my thoughts on Singapore versus Dubai. But those are my thoughts. What are your thoughts? Feel free to comment below. Drop me a line. HEJ.tax. Thank you.
So if you're a 6, 7, or 8-figure investor, entrepreneur, or business owner who needs a tailor-made solution from a qualified team of professionals, we can help you achieve the international lifestyle, the freedom, and even the tax savings you're looking for. Visit us at htj.tax and live that international life.